I only want to be in relationship with people who I'd be happy to get a no from.
Welcome everyone to another episode of I Like Networking. This week we have a very, very special guest, someone very close to my heart. Isabel Foxen Duke is the creator of Stop Fighting Food, a free online training program for those recovering from diet binge cycling and or feeling crazy around food. She's also the founder of the Sundar Lodge Center for Weight Neutral Coaching, an online training program for coaches and wellness professionals committed to providing diet and recovery services from a weight neutral perspective. She's a fixture and thought leader in the greater body positive movement. She's been featured in the Huffington Post, Elle Magazine, Refinery 21, and has been praised by Lena, Dunham, Ricki, and so many more. Her writing and free guide, How to Not Eat Cake Really Fast Standing Up When Nobody's Looking, can be found at isabelfoxenduke.com, and you can watch her free video training series at Stop Finding Food. I know this sounds a bit off topic for us, but full disclaimer, I was a client of Isabel's. I've struggled with eating disorders for most of my life, and it was through Isabel's program that I really found some peace with it all. So I highly recommend it if you are struggling with something. But always work with a professional. Full disclaimer for us. Why I wanted to talk to Isabel is actually because she has a very interesting journey. She studied sociology. She had a stint at rehab because of her eating disorder and her drug abuse situation. But essentially, she built a huge online coaching platform through blogging and then through videos and newsletters that's way before Instagram, like YouTube, or even a thing. So she has a very different approach to marketing. She teaches people how to build their own following and client base. So I think a lot of what she has to offer in terms of business building is really useful for anyone going out on their own, becoming a freelancer, an entrepreneur, but also to do things on your own terms. It's a really great conversation. We talk about a lot of intimate details, to be honest, but I think it's an important conversation to have. So I hope you enjoy this. Isabel, very happy to have you here with us. Beautiful name, obviously.
Thank
Can
you.
you quickly tell us where you're from, where you're currently based, and what is it that you currently do for a living?
Yeah. So I'm from New York City. I was born and raised New Yorker, although about 5.5 years ago, I moved to San Francisco, California, which is, just a completely different energy and has just, I feel, made me a different person in so many ways. But I, for many years, for the past decade, have been working as a coach, working with folks around ending diet binge cycling. I call it healing your crazy around food, right? Or stopping that feeling of feeling crazy around food, which is how so many of my clients identify and how I certainly identified when I was struggling with food. And more recently, I've been getting into teacher training and really working with the sort of growing number of wellness professionals who want to adopt anti diet practices in their work, who want to adopt weight neutral and health at every size practices in their work. So that is sort of the newest iteration of my work in the past 3 or 4 years.
Thanks, Isabel. That's super clear. And full disclaimer, I was how do I say this, a client or like a
Ah,
patient? I don't even know what I was.
yeah,
Yeah,
you
I did
exactly.
your course that's like online. I've struggled with anorexia for most of my life now, for most half of my life now, which is super exciting. But it was really after I did a lot of like um, sort of treatments on and off, but it was not until I found you that things actually turned around for me. So I vouch for your program 100%.
Oh, thanks. Yes, you did. I want to make sure. So you did the master class. That's correct. The Stop Fighting Food
Yes,
master class, right?
yes,
Yes.
with the
Perfect.
group calls, yeah. And
Yes.
I actually give that. I tell everyone about it, even if they haven't had, even if they don't have like a diagnosed eating disorder, if they just have like a disordered relationship with food, because a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just really grateful that I found you, because it really, I don't think it's a small to say that you changed my life for the better. And I'm so glad that I've gone through it. And
Oh,
it's been since then, obviously, after I finished your program, it took a few more months or maybe another year to feel like fully
yep.
kind of like I owned it, but I haven't felt this like clear in my mind for
Mm.
so long, So really excited to talk to you, because
Oh,
what you do is amazing, and you've been doing this work for so long.
oh, I am so glad to hear that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That means the world. And yeah, the master class is really, that's sort of the foundational program of my work. That's really, how I um have best dispelled sort of the core message of what I do, and sort of the root of how I help people who are recovering from, quote unquote food issues. So yeah, I'm so glad to hear that was your experience in the master class, because that is really that class was my first baby, and really kind of I put all of my most important, most influential material around what I've found to be the most just effective kind of new ways of thinking about food in our body, based on my own personal experience, as well as tons of research, and then also working with clients for several years. So I'm so glad that you had that experience. And yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you a little bit more about sort of the business side of things today.
Yes, I really want to do all that. Like, I wanted to interview you especially because of this. At least in the UK, a lot of people who are especially from the creative industry have gone and started their own businesses or gone freelance because of the COVID impact.
Yep.
And obviously, something else that's been happening is that people's mental health has been, it's been difficult for people that have any mental health issues, obviously, at this point. And there's been a lot of talk about the quarantine weight, blah, blah, blah. But one thing that I've always thought it was brilliant about you is that you built this amazing business literally before, I think, even Instagram was totally on the scene.
Yeah.
You had your video series, you did the newsletter, so you have a really great, I think, business acumen. And I'm really excited to talk about all that, because I feel like your lessons here will be super valid for any entrepreneur thinking, because a lot of people receive the same messages, like you need to have a big following on social media to do anything, to
Yep.
sell your services, etc. You need to put yourself out there and do 10,000 reels pointing at stuff and singing songs. That's literally like I've never seen you do any of those things.
It's true.
You're Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I really don't. I barely. I mean, I'm maybe I won't go so far as say barely, but yeah, kind of barely. I mean, I barely use social media. I don't really. Social media is not my primary way of running my business. I use social media to the extent that I want to, but it is not my primary strategy at all. And I do think that, especially with some of the challenges that we're kind of facing around social media, you're hearing more people talk about this documentary, The Social Dilemma, and kind of talking about kind of the darker side of social media. I think there's a growing demand for various reasons for people to start thinking about how they can market themselves outside of social media. And again, I think that social media is obviously a really powerful marketing tool, but it's certainly not the only way to market yourself. It is not my personal favorite way to market myself. And I think that the sort of mythology that you have to be on social in order to succeed in business, aside from just being untrue, also prevents a lot of people from engaging in marketing opportunities that might just be better suited to them. Right, social media requires kind of a specific personality type, in my opinion, one that I probably don't have, quite frankly. And so there's so many people who I think have so much to offer the world, even in the land of online marketing. And this idea that you need to be on social, I think, isn't super helpful necessarily to those folks. It like keeps people from focusing on the things that, might be more nourishing to them in their business long term.
Yeah, 100%. So, Isabel, before we dive into all the business strategy, can you? I know you said this
million times, especially in US podcasts, but our audience here is mainly UK based, and
Okay.
I think 99% women. So can you give us like a whistle stop tour to how you started doing this anti-diet work? Because your story is pretty intense and I think really
It is.
interesting as well.
Thank you. I mean, so or I don't know if that's a thank you. Interesting. Yeah, interesting because of all of the different like twists and turns. And I think everyone who's ever dieted and anyone who's ever really dieted chronically or struggled with disordered eating probably has a painful history that is unique to them. But I'm certainly not, I'm certainly an example of that. I grew up, struggling with disordered eating my entire life. That went pretty much completely undiagnosed, unnoticed, because I never was the weight class that maybe, I think still today people associate with disordered eating, right? People think of eating disorders and they think of somebody who is very, very, very thin. When the reality of the situation is that 95% of people who struggle with disordered eating, you would not know it by looking at them, right? That's the reality of what's going on in the world. And, for many, many years, I struggled primarily with, what you might consider just classic diet binge cycling, but I didn't experience it. I didn't understand it as diet binge cycling because dieting was so normalized. Dieting to me was constantly being told was the solution to my problem, the problem that is, being a woman with a body that doesn't necessarily fit the whatever ideal I was going for at the time. And so this concept of diet binge cycling, I didn't even really have the language at that time to describe myself that way. I just thought, why can't I get my food under control? Why can't I get my body under control? Why can't I, stick to my diet, basically? Like, why can't I just eat the thing that I need to eat to stay thin? I want it so badly. I want it so badly. Why can't I do it? And of course, I was never really able to stick to my diet for any long period of time. I did the very natural, biologically instinctive thing, which is to rebel against my diet, to fall off the wagon, kind of oscillate between these intense periods of restriction. And then, of course, kind of ever more intense binge eating episodes as well, right? So the sort of oscillations between the two got more and more severe as time went on. And then I eventually, I did land myself in treatment, not because of diet binge cycling, though. I landed myself in treatment because I was so desperate to lose weight towards the end. I was so desperate to like finally do the thing called get thin enough, whatever that meant, that I, ended up I was using drugs to control my weight. I was using stimulant medications to control my weight. And very, very quickly into entering that phase of my disordered eating, I did end up in rehab for drug abuse. And, subsequently, it became very clear to folks, oh, she has an eating disorder. That's what's going on here. So I think, from my perspective, it was when I was in eating disorder treatment that the real work began, because I couldn't get effective treatment when I was in eating disorder rehab, right? I mean, everyone was kind of telling me the same thing. It was like, don't eat too little, don't eat too much. It was like the Goldilocks, like just eat this right amount, which was, a very diety thing for me at the time. I was constantly just trying to make my food right, even in the context of eating disorder treatment. No one was really addressing the underlying causes of why I was struggling so much with my body image to begin with. Everyone was operating under, very weight normative assumptions that, when you're mentally and physically healthy, you will land within this very specific BMI range, which is not true for the vast majority of people. Right. And so I came up against all of these obstacles in the context of eating disorder treatment that I now recognize were a result of living in a world where our medical system, right, the system in which we are treating eating disorders, is very, very wrapped up in fat phobic politics, right? And in a sort of political environment where fat is constantly being demonized, right? You cannot say obesity is a disease on the one hand and then effectively treat eating disorders on the other. It's not possible. And so this took me quite a long time, several years into attempts at treatment, for me to really unravel this and understand this. And I think to this day, there are so many people in eating disorder treatment for all varieties of eating disorders who don't understand, who are struggling, don't understand why they can't get better. And the very basics of getting weight neutral care isn't even being met for these folks. So I remember, at certain point in my sort of treatment journey, discovering intuitive eating. Just for the record, this is so long ago, right? Or maybe not, depends on sort of where you are, but just for the record, right? I wasn't even being taught about intuitive eating in my inpatient rehab. I mean, it was a huge struggle even just to get to the point to learn about intuitive eating, which I think a lot of people take for granted. Like that's like an obvious given in eating disorder treatment. It's not. I remember eventually getting, kind of learning about intuitive eating. And, at that point in my life, I thought intuitive eating was the path to this like correct, healthful BMI in quotes, that everyone promised would be at the sort of the pot of gold at the end of the treatment rainbow or something. And I pursued intuitive eating in this sort of diety way and continued to struggle with it. I would, kind of fall off what I now jokingly refer to as the hunger and fullness diet, which is sort of when you treat intuitive eating like it's a diet, where it's like, oh, I ate when I didn't stop at the correct amount of full, or oh, I ate when I wasn't hungry, or whatever the case may be. And at a certain point, I remember just kind of throwing in the towel, right? And just really, kind of getting so fed up, so overwhelmed with all these attempts at trying to get my food right, and just being so just down about all of my failures at trying to get my food right, that I just was like, you know what? I can't even try anymore. Like, I'm just going to eat whatever the hell I eat. And it is what it is, right? I can't obsess. I can't be bothered obsessing about this anymore. And if that means I gain weight, I gain weight. I'm done. I gave up on trying to get my food and body right. And I just was like, I'm going to just live my life, and whatever my food and body looks like is fine. It is what it is. I don't have the energy to worry about this. I don't have the energy to obsess about this or make myself wrong for this or judge myself for this. I'm just going to let it be what it wants to be. And that's when I really started blogging about sort of divesting. I started blogging about this experience of really divesting from obsessing about food in my body. I started blogging about divesting from, making myself wrong for what I ate or doing intuitive eating correctly, or all of these things that at the time, there were lots of professionals out there talking about intuitive eating and diet recovery, but they weren't really getting to the real root of the issue, which was this obsession with making ourselves right or wrong based on what we eat, which was this feeling of there's a right way to do intuitive eating or a wrong way to do intuitive eating, or if you eat intuitively correctly, you'll look like this or like that. And so I just started blogging about my experiences, basically saying, fuck it to all of these ideas, which coincidentally, Caroline Dooner, who's the author of The Fuck It Diet, who's a great friend of mine, very old friend of mine and colleague at this point. She was blogging about a similar thing around the same time. Hers was literally called The Fuck It Diet. And, this was around the time when blogging was really relevant. I think now like the world of blogging has changed a lot, and using blogging as a strategy for, sharing your voice is it's a different thing now than it was then. This was, 10 years ago, maybe even more. And I remember getting, kind of a few different things happened over the course of my business that we can talk more about, but basically I really started to kind of develop this voice as a writer, specifically talking about this issue. And it was resonating with people, and I, kind of simultaneously was getting my coaching certification. I was actually working full time at the Institute for Integrative Nutrition while this was all going on. There were, certain things that were happening that were kind of lining up for me in terms of, kind of right time, right place. I mean, I don't think it was that coincidental. Obviously, this was what I was interested in, and I was going for what I was, I sort of had a vision of where I wanted to go. And yeah, eventually, kind of blogging, my own blog very quickly turned into a lot of guest blogging opportunities and kind of writing for, I got interest from editors at places like, Huffington Post Women or Refinery 29 or, various other, I remember what was Mind Body Green at that time was just getting off the ground. They didn't have a ton of writers. And I remember I would write for them, a bunch. And would always kind of get a lot of attention when I was writing for them, largely because it wasn't nearly as saturated a kind of publishing house as maybe it is today. And so, yeah, this became, there was sort of like, I felt like I was a new voice on the scene talking about this issue in a fresh way. That was also really tied to a personal experience that I think people resonated with. I talk about that a lot too with my mentorship clients, is sort of how to use your story in a provocative way, how to use your story to really connect with people's emotions and sort of create trust and create, an environment of support. And yeah, and so very, very quickly through this process of kind of sharing my story, sharing my writing, sharing what I was learning through primarily blogging at the time. My early days of my career were really focused on blogging. I, very, very, very quickly developed a full client load that eventually developed into the masterclass, which is a larger group coaching program that still exists today and is still my flagship program. This is the program you were in. And yeah, there has been many iterations of my work and my business. My business has evolved significantly since then. Again, this was, a decade ago-ish. But that is kind of the beginning. That is certainly the beginning of how I started doing this work and how I got into this field.
I love that. I feel like you're such a trailblazer in so many ways in terms of course, in terms of your business, because you're like a digital first business. You've always been, as far as I know, and you've been blogging for a decade. Then you started, doing videos, and
Yep.
that was like free content to bring people to your newsletter, which is something that everyone talks about right now. But what's funny? I don't really remember how I came to you, but I remember that the videos, I was really interested. And for me, what made a big difference, first of all, I started treatment when I was 17. I never heard about intuitive eating until I met you. So it's definitely not a thing.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And at
Good.
least not in my time. And I I remember that I was really taken by a lot of what you were saying, because on lots of your podcasts where you talk more about the dieting aspect and the dieting industry, you talk a lot about like social justice issues
Yep.
as well.
Yep.
And you really explain all of that, and like bodies across history and all that stuff so clearly, especially during the masterclass. So for me, that was like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, looking at things into context, into like historical and social context was really important. But
Totally.
that's like a personal anecdote.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, honestly, I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in, and one of the things that I really am passionate about training my professional mentees around, right, is how do you make justice conversations really like understandable in somebody's day-to-day life? I mean, I think that so many people kind of intellectually know that we have this problem called, pressure to look a certain way. And then they think about, their relationship with food and their disordered relationship with food almost like it's something separate, or like maybe they kind of intellectually see that they're related, but they don't fully embody them as being like that very, very tied, right? Like you cannot address one without the other. Like until you are not going beyond seeing this cultural problem as like something that I'm reading about the news, and really looking at my relationship to this cultural problem. How am I going to relate to this fat phobic culture differently in my day-to-day life? How does this actually affect me like really deeply in these very specific ways in my relationships, in my dating life, in my relationship with my doctor, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like, until I'm doing that work, I'm kind of missing the real root of the issue. And I think that was a big thing for me to understand. I mean, I remember I always went, you know, I have a degree in sociology, and I always thought of myself as being justice oriented well before, you know, I healed in my relationship with food. But they just, for some reason, it like wasn't clicking for me. Oh, like, this problem that we have about this pressure to look a certain way, or this pressure to weigh a certain amount, or whatever, actually really is affecting me on a day-to-day basis. And until I really get in there and figure out how I can personally relate to the world differently, nothing's going to change for me. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a big conversation that people, again, intellectually think about, but don't necessarily embody, if that makes sense.
Friends, this is a quick break to tell you about our amazing sponsors Day, and women-led company revolutionizing your periods with sustainable tampons you can be proud of. They're clinically validated, cramp-soothing CBD tampons delivered straight to your door whenever it fits your cycle. To get £5 off your first box of tampons or probiotics, just head over to yourday.com and use the code networking5.
Yeah, 100%. And now I'm thinking about it, that you were like kind of predicting kind of like Clubhouse, because
Yeah.
all your stuff was basically online. It was not online, but it was like audio tracks. It was like on SoundCloud. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about how you set up the program. And so you started with the masterclass. Like, you didn't have any like role models, as far as I know, because you know there wasn't a lot of people doing what you were doing. Like, how did you figure out how to host people, and then how did you start getting your first clients? I think that's an important question.
So I was, like, as I mentioned, you know, so I went to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. I was working at the Institute for Integrative Nutrition at the time, which is not a weight neutral program by any stretch of the imagination. But it is a space that is pumping out health coaches left and right, right? And there are a lot of alumni coming out of that program who are, you know, very invested in, you know, sort of the world, the business of life coaching, right? I mean, I think integrative nutrition is kind of like the center. They were one of the sort of, you want to talk about pioneers, they were kind of one of the pioneers of this sort of online business of wellness, and kind of really, you know, kind of carved the path for a lot of what I consider to be like wellness-based online marketers. And so I remember I actually hired a business coach who, you know, had an awesome business similar to one that I wanted, right? I mean, in reality, she didn't do anything very different than what I do now, although she was not weight neutral. She was not health at every size. She was, you know, one of the many coaches who was selling intuitive eating effectively, essentially, from, you know, from the perspective of selling weight loss, right? So she was kind of like a diety intuitive eating person, which, by the way, there were tons of those folks at this time, right? Like at this time, again, this was like 10 years ago-ish, that was a popular stance. That was a big hot trend, was intuitive eating for weight loss, the intuitive eating diet, or different. I mean, everyone had sort of different flavors of that, but that was kind of the idea. There weren't, as far as I was aware, I'd never even heard of health at every size. I now know that there were a lot of larger bodied people talking about health at every size, some of which were even doing it online, right? Like people like Reagan Chastain, or, Golda Paretsky was another person who I know was talking about health at every size and talking about, you know, real fat positivity online, you know, even back then. But I was not aware of them. And I certainly didn't know any there were certainly, as far as I'm aware, no thin wellness professionals talking about this. They were all selling weight loss, or kind of selling look like me. And I was working with one of them for online marketing support. I hired one of these people as a business coach because I knew I had something to say, right? My blog was, doing well, and I had this coaching certification. I knew I wanted to, support people in making a change. I knew that I had overcome something in my life, something huge, something important. I knew that I had really changed my relationship with food in a significant way. And I remember hiring this, who was effectively, she was a business coach to me. And I said, I overcame my binge eating disorder, for lack of a better word, right? I really overcame this problem, but I didn't lose weight. And aren't people going to want to come to me? Who's going to want to work with me if I didn't lose weight? And she said, Isabel, you don't have to sell weight loss, right? Like, if you have a solution to a problem, that's all that you need, right? You don't need to make weight the problem. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's true. I do have a solution to a problem. And part of that solution to that problem is actually accepting the body that I have, right? I mean, that really is part of the solution to the problem of disordered eating, right? Even including, and I think for binge eaters, right? Which many binge eaters sort of get this message that, when they solve their problem, they will lose weight. And that is not true for the vast majority of them. So this all to say, I remember that kind of being like a light bulb moment, if you will, the sort of idea that I could actually talk about healing your relationship with food without making weight loss the goal. And this was at a time when, I mean, just thinking about it now, I'm kind of mind blown thinking, wow, it didn't even occur to me. I needed to actually have somebody tell me that I could talk about food issues without weight loss being the goal. Because at the time it was like, well, who's going to hire me? Of course, if you're talking about food issues, you need to be able to promise weight loss. Of course, you need to be able to do that. Otherwise, what are you even doing? What are you even offering people? So just to get that permission from this person who they themselves was a weight loss professional, they were not even health at every size at that time. They were just a business and marketer who just gave me permission. You do not need to sell weight loss, right? If that's not true to you, if that's not your experience, if that's not real, you don't have to. And I started getting really honest about my experience, which is that I healed my relationship with food, specifically, a lifelong struggle with pretty severe binge eating. And I didn't lose weight, but I have my sanity now, and I really just decided, like, that's my story. That's what I'm selling. And pretty quickly into making that transition, I started doing a ton of research about body image work, right? And being like, okay, if you're going to, right, if your product is heal your relationship with food, not for weight loss, but for your mental health, right? And really love and accept the body that you have today, if that's going to be your message, you need to really like hone in on your body image work and really understand deeply what's going on for people on a body image level outside of your own personal experience, which is incredibly important, especially now. I recognize how smart, how grateful I am that occurred to me as a normatively thin person, to recognize that my personal experience with body image was not going to cut it if I was going to be supporting people who were facing disordered eating at different sizes, and not able to promise them weight loss, and not even talking to them about weight loss being the goal, actually encouraging them to let go of weight loss as the goal. So I started doing a ton of research, and one of the very first people that I came across was Virgie Tovar. She was also just getting started with her online marketing world at this time. This was maybe 7 years ago, I want to say. I don't even remember. I mean, these timelines are kind of all over the place. But Virgie herself was just getting started. She was just kind of like making a name for herself online, right? This was like the beginning of the body positive movement as we know it on the internet. And she had a YouTube channel, right? And I don't even remember what it was called, but she had a YouTube channel. You could probably dig it up if the videos are still there. But I found this video, and it was called like Virgie Tovar's Guide to Ending Fat Phobia or something along those lines. And I just fell in love with Virgie. I mean, I just it was like I could not get enough of her. And I like immediately like stalked her down, like basically made her my friend. And I started learning everything I possibly could about fat positivity and fat justice. And she was really the beginning of my going deeper, of really understanding fatness as a social justice issue beyond just what had previously occurred to me, which is, oh, we have this sort of beauty culture and, women are supposed to be thin, blah, blah, blah. Now I really understood it wasn't just about sexism, and it wasn't just about, the pressure to look a certain way, that we were dealing with like really, really, really serious oppression, specifically of larger bodied people. That was something that I never learned about in my sociology degree, which now looking back on that is just insane to me, that I, have a bachelor's in sociology and the concept of weight discrimination didn't even come up one time. And I now see it as this such hugely prevalent, just massively, like overwhelmingly, oppressive system that affects so many people in the world. I mean, like at least a third of the United States, right, is actively dealing with active oppression, right? Not just pressure to look a certain way, but oppression in medical systems, like unequal access to healthcare, oppression in terms of how they're seen in courts of law, employment opportunities. Like this was a completely mind-blowing concept to me. Like I did not realize that this is what's happening. And that, I think it was around that time that I really started to step into, okay, my brand now is going to revolve around this, right? There is no such thing as an intuitive eating and anti-diet approach without a deep understanding of how these systems of oppression work and affect people of all sizes differently at varying sizes. And so, yeah, that was sort of became my mission, right? Was to, kind of bring this understanding to more people. And I started writing about this quite a bit. And, thankfully, there were a lot of other folks who I think of as sort of being my peers at the time, who were kind of on the internet at these sort of earlier stages of the body positive movement with me, who have also done incredible work. And these are folks of all different sizes. And this became, really the trajectory of what, has now become my work.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks so much for that overview. And I completely agree that whoever told you to tell your story and sell your solution was right, at least on that, because I identified with you on that aspect, and because you were super straightforward about, your relationship with it. So I think, when you're going through something personal, it's always kind of not good, because I don't wish this upon anyone, but it's somehow reassuring that the other person like kind of will understand what you went through. And
Yes.
one thing that for me got me was that you spoke a lot throughout the whole masterclass, that that you had energy to actually put into other things right now, like
Yeah.
that, it didn't consume all your life and all your day. And that is like the truest thing of all time. Whenever I have the idea of potentially relapsing, like sometimes you feel tempted, especially at times like this where you have zero control of anything, and
Yeah.
you're like, oh, maybe I should go back to that. And then you're like, oh my god, no, but the energy that's gonna be wasted on this is just not
Yeah.
worth it.
Exactly. And it's funny because, as you know from the masterclass, one of sort of the key sort of components is this real challenge of this idea that we are in control of our weight. And I got a question recently. I mean, I get this question all the time, but it's popped up in my inbox in the past couple of days. So it's on the top of my mind. Somebody said, well, what about, how do you say that to somebody who's, a quote unquote successful dieter? They're clearly able to control their weight. And I say, well, but at what cost, right? It's like it's sort of, controlling your weight will end up controlling you eventually, right? It will end up taking over your life. You're not really in control of it, right? If you're a person who's quote unquote successfully dieting, the lifestyle that requires, what that takes basically depends upon obsession. It depends upon you being completely not in control, basically being a, quote unquote slave to dieting, and kind of bending your entire life around that weight loss goal. Right. So, I think that's, an important thing to remember, regardless of whether or not you're a person who is a diet binge cycler who, was never capable of dieting for very long before you would binge your face off, basically. Or if you're a person who is really good at dieting, but dieting ended up being the thing that controlled your life, right? Either way, right? There's no good outcome here.
Yeah, no, 100%. So, I would be super interested in. So, basically, for anyone who doesn't know, the masterclass, when I did it a few years ago, it was you received, emails, and there were like calls that you could connect. I think there were, I don't even remember how they were done because there was no Zoom. Maybe it's Skype. Was it Skype?
Oh, it was conference call. It's still
Yeah,
on conference call. Yeah.
conference call, and then you had this kind of library of recordings, which was amazing, and then the sessions. So
Yep.
it was all on this portal. But now and then you had started to do the more of like training others to become professionals, more or less like you, right?
Yep.
Or to
Yes.
promote the anti-diet message. So how has this transition been, and when did you realize, okay, this is potentially a new market to tap in, or is this something that's where my mission is going to go? Because of course things evolve, and you've been doing this for ages. So how has it been for you? What have you been doing to set that up? Like, just
Yeah.
give us a brief intro on that business.
So I don't really, I actually think of the teacher training more as an addition rather than a transition. I mean, in some ways, it's a transition, but the master class will always exist. I mean, the master class is that sort of like beautiful, like perfect flagship program that really is where, I get to be of service to folks who are struggling. That program will always be there. It will always be available to anyone who needs it. And that program in many ways was like divinely inspired. I think of, like there was some magic that happened with that program that really is impactful and influential and affects so many people. And I always want to make sure that it is available. And I also want to make sure that I, contribute my own live coaching to that program to some extent. Always. I still do live calls for that program. I still make sure that anyone in that program who wants to talk to me, who wants to ask me questions or get coached by me directly, has the opportunity. So the masterclass is kind of always going to be there as sort of the flagship, this is what I do. That being said, I would say it was about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, pretty quickly after the masterclass first launched in 2014, I started getting requests from professionals who wanted to learn how to support people in this way, right? I started getting requests from coaches, from nutritionists, from fitness professionals, from therapists, from social workers. I mean, people all across the boards who are client facing in some way, who really wanted to learn how to effectively support people in letting go of dieting, from healing from diet culture, and learning to be with their bodies in a new way. And there was just not a lot of programs like that out there. I mean, quite frankly, there are a handful. I think there are starting to, pop up more programs and sort of certifications in this area. Obviously, I think the majority of them really revolve around intuitive eating, which in my opinion is an awesome thing to learn, an important thing for professionals to understand, but it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you really need to understand to support people making this kind of life transition, out of diet culture, right? I mean, in my work, I mean, as you know from taking the master class, intuitive eating is just module 1, and then you have, several more modules to go thereafter, right? I mean, there's so much more to the process of recovery than intuitive eating. And so it was really important for me to give coaches tools and skills for actually supporting people around the different emotional challenges that people face as they're making this transition, to support people around, how do you coach around body image specifically? I mean, even that, there's just not a lot of teacher training and professional training in how to do that work effectively. And so, yeah, I would say pretty quickly after the masterclass came out, I started getting requests from folks who wanted professional support. And I did what I recommend even my mentees do, which is I started working with people privately one-on-one to develop these skills. So I started, in addition to the masterclass, I started taking on private clients who were professionals in the space. And I started doing these private mentorships with folks around the different areas of their business where they felt that they needed support. right? So some folks, they felt they really needed support in how to work with people around body image specifically. Some folks felt that they needed support around, how to work with folks who are living in larger bodies when they themselves have a different lived experience, who are living in a thinner body. Some folks needed support around transitioning their business and marketing, right? So it is not uncommon for specifically professionals who have a history of working in the wellness industry to have to completely rebrand and change everything on their website and change everything in terms of like how they present their work to be more weight neutral and to actually transition into an anti-diet approach from what was probably most likely a weight loss focused or diet approach if they worked in the healthcare industry, if they worked in healthcare at all or the wellness industry at all prior to discovering, this sort of new way of operating, right? So there are all these sort of different kinds of specific challenges that people were coming to me in the realm of professional support that people wanted help with. And so I started doing these sort of private mentorships, and over time, it became really, really clear to me, what were the core themes that professionals across the boards were dealing with, right? They needed support in helping people around how to do things like, how do you work with people dealing with different kinds of medical conditions or dealing with medical restrictions around food? They needed support with, just helping folks overcome fear around food and judgment around food, helping folks with body image, helping folks with basically all of the different areas that, one could face in diet recovery through the diet recovery process. And then also specialized topics that their clients might deal with that maybe they themselves didn't deal with in their recovery, right? Like, just because you haven't had diabetes yourself doesn't mean you don't probably need to have at least some idea of, what somebody who's diabetic is facing when they're, moving into diet recovery. Because the reality of the situation is, if you have a bunch of clients in your practice, there's a likelihood you're going to have somebody with diabetes in your programs, right? So, these kinds of issues are what I really wanted to make sure. I wanted to develop a really strong curriculum around best practices for working with people from stage one of the diet recovery practice, right? Stage one being working with people who are just starting to transition into intuitive eating, all the way through the different phases of recovery, dealing with medical stuff, dealing with health at every size stuff, dealing with all the different types of fat phobia that different clients might be facing at different sizes, interpersonal fat phobia, intrapersonal internalized fat phobia, institutional fat phobia, etc. And then, of course, about at least a quarter of the program is on business and marketing, right? And sort of how to run an anti-diet body positive business and what are sort of best practices for marketing in this field. So yeah, so that was, I will say, another thing that was really lacking in some of the other very, very few and far between trainings that there even are in the non-diet world. There's not a lot of business support. Most of the sort of big certification trainings that I'm at least aware of in this space are run by nutritionists or therapists who, generally speaking, don't have quite the same pressure to promote themselves necessarily the same way, a coach who is not getting referrals from a doctor would. And then also, again, I think, just in general, culturally speaking, therapists and nutritionists, there's not as much of an emphasis on marketing, and there's not a lot of training. They certainly don't get a lot of training in online marketing the way somebody who, comes out of a place like Institute for Integrative Nutrition might, right? I mean, that is something that I think the coaching industry is doing really well, is they really get online marketing. They really understand how to grow a business. The problem is that most of them are doing it in the super exploitative, weight normative way. And there is another way to do it. There is another way to succeed in online marketing and also be doing so ethically and in alignment with your values. And so that is, kind of what I'm trying to bring to the table as well.
Yeah, I think some things that jump at me from your experience, like analyzing it from afar, and you may disagree with me because you're in it. But what I feel like you've done right, or that's worked for you, is that you kept your sort of business structure light enough so you could test out the ideas that you had hunches like, okay, I feel like this is the way to go, and test it out in a way that wasn't a huge risk so that you could like adapt and see, okay, this is the best format for this or this or this. And like, if anyone goes to your website, which I'll link on the show notes, it's like a very simple, like, first page, and the copy is like super on point. It's very succinct, and you like immediately get what this is about. So it's also like very clear and to the point, and also representative of your voice, right? Because
Yeah.
I think it's sometimes it can be harder when you're starting to find a voice or maybe mimic others, but it really, like, it's really strange how, I don't like this word because it gets so hyped, but like authenticity really shines through digital platforms.
Yep.
Uh, and so, but yeah, that's how I would say, like, you seem to be someone who is very nimble in terms of business structure and able to, like, okay, I'll try this out, I'll test it. Okay, there's a demand. How do I market this properly and how do I make this sustainable? Is that more or less how you operate?
Yeah, it's all about, I mean, I think specifically for wellness professionals, and again, I literally give this advice to my mentees, start with private coaching, right? Like start just working with people one-on-one, because that's where you're going to really learn what works, what people want, what people need, what people want and need from you versus from another professional, right? I mean, and so, yeah, that's exactly what I did. When I started getting interest in the sort of professional training, I just started working with people one on one. And I was working with people one on one exclusively, in terms of professionals. I was just doing one on one mentorship programs between, I think maybe let's call it 2016 is when I probably took on my first professional mentorship client. And I didn't launch my, kind of formal teacher training until 2020. So this was, there was, 4 years of really kind of doing quite a bit of experiential research, really understanding what do professionals need, what are their biggest blocks to doing this work powerfully, to doing this work well. And I feel really proud of the program that I've created, because I know that this is really hitting the major points that so many professionals are dealing with in this space.
Yeah, Isabel, thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to get to the two final questions, okay? If we
Yeah,
can.
of course.
Right. So, one question I had for you was, what do you consider like one of your biggest career failures or like worst career experiences? Can be anything, can be even like a job interview.
So this is not just, interesting question. I have to decide what I am willing to share openly. So I will say probably, I don't know if this is my biggest career failure, but it's definitely, some of the things that I have the most shame about, and the things that I kind of most regret are, kind of partnering or developing business relationships with folks who were not aligned with my mission. I remember very early on, like I said, there weren't a lot of people in this sort of body positive health at every size world, and I was constantly trying to promote myself and get my name out there and quote unquote network. And I kind of got in bed, and I won't get into too much detail, but I did end up getting in bed with people who were, not totally aligned with me, because I just wanted to, get my name out there and, like, do whatever I could to speak my voice. And while I think that my intentions were probably good, I really learned fast that came to bite me in the butt pretty hard, pretty quickly. And I think of that as like there was like a cautionary tale that I won't get into too much detail about, but that is something that I really warn people against is, I think a lot of people say like, oh, think to themselves, oh, well, if I'm getting my name out there, does it really matter that I'm, if I'm helping to spread the message to people that wouldn't otherwise hear it, does it really matter that I'm, kind of getting in bed with somebody who maybe isn't totally aligned with, in a values way with me. And my experience has been, I've had some really painful experiences around that and learned some really difficult lessons. So I always just encourage people to think twice about that, because I think that that's a really easy thing to do. it's a really easy thing to rationalize when you just want to share a message, but you you know like, and I think it's sometimes hard to see, the kind of the darker side of it, but there certainly is one. So that's what I'll share for now.
No, that's great. I think first of all, that's a really important lesson. I think it probably happens to more people than it does, than we
Yeah.
hear the
Yeah.
it's I think it's a difficult lesson to learn, but it actually ties in quite well with our like final thoughts and final question because obviously, as you know, we're called I Like Networking, and throughout my career in the creative industries, I've always worked on the collaboration over competition sort of
Yeah.
motto, and I really truly believe in that. But as you said, you have to kind of choose as well who you collaborate with.
Yes.
But you mentioned a bunch of professionals here. You mentioned Virgie Tovar, you mentioned Caroline Dunner, and it's obviously still, I guess, I don't know how big it is to be honest. I'm talking out of my head here, but I don't know that many professionals that do anti-diet work. At least, definitely not in Brazil, where I'm from. As far as I know, not that many as well in the UK. I think maybe a few more in the US, but it's not as widespread as it probably should be. But how did you always see like people that worked in the same field as you, or do you see them as potential collaborators and people to learn from, or what's your best sort of like networking tip?
Well, my best networking tip, first of all, I think that that's a great attitude to take, is right, this distinction between thinking of people as competitors and, kind of letting that go and kind of really seeing the truth, which is that, rising tides lift all boats, right? And thinking about, people as collaborators and people who are ultimately helping you propel a mission that really helps everyone. I don't really think that there's such a thing as competition in the world of body positivity. We have so much more work to do. There are hundreds of millions of people who need to hear this. We need as much help as we can get, right? Where this is not an oversaturated market by any stretch. But what I will say is, in terms of just like networking tips, like how to develop relationships with people who, may end up becoming collaborators or may end up becoming, cross promoters, is just the term that I usually use with folks. The primary tip is just really developing relationships with people in a genuine way, right? Really like developing relationships with people who you want to have relationships with, not just people that you want to get something from. Right. And those are really, I think that I've spent also had many times in my life where I've tried to pursue relationships with people because I wanted something from them. And those relationships never proved super fruitful and they caused a lot of pain, I think, for probably me and them. And I remember kind of, this was a few years ago. This was around the time I moved to San Francisco. I was learning a lot of hard lessons in New York in my early career. But I remember something that came out of moving to San Francisco. I remember making a commitment to myself, I'm only going to put my energy into developing professional contacts with people that I really respect and that I want to be friends with and that I want to have a relationship with and that like I really authentically enjoy, and I'm not just trying to get something out of it. Because if I'm just trying to get something out of it, like it, I think it's going to be painful for me to be pursuing. It's going to be an anxiety provoking relationship for me. And it can be felt on the other side. Right. And it's just, again, for so many different reasons, I feel like that is the type of attitude towards business that makes business so in the long term really uncomfortable and stressful and unhappy. And for me, it led to burnout. When I was in New York, I was doing so much networking and trying to get my stuff promoted, but it was really, I had a real transactional way of operating in New York. In addition to, sometimes collaborating with people and, kind of taking on projects that weren't aligned with my values. And all of that became so stressful. It really prompted me to end up having to leave New York and move to California. I was like, I need a break. I'm burning out. And a big part of that was because I was approaching the work of building relationships in my industry in the wrong way. And yeah, now it's, for me, it is like if I'm not excited about developing a connection with somebody, if I'm not excited about just being in touch, even if I get a no from them, if I ask for something, then there's no point in me even like developing that. There's no point in even me trying for that one, you know, like I only want to be in relationship with people who I'd be happy to get a no from.
I love that. That's incredible. That's a
Yeah,
really good way to see it.
yeah,
Um, Thank you so much. Okay, Isabel, thank you so, so much for your time. I 100% thank you from the bottom of my heart from doing the work you do, because you did change a lot of things in my life. I don't think I would have been able to set up I Like Networking if I had spent the whole quarantine thinking about my weight instead of thinking about how I could positively impact people's lives during a pandemic, like honestly.
yeah,
So
totally.
thank you. And now, before we close, can you give us your call to action? So, how can people work with you or,
Yeah,
access your resources? Give us
yeah.
all the spiel.
Well, definitely, if you want to get sort of the vibe, the download on, how I work with people around food and body and what sort of my core food and body messages are, specifically, helping folks who are struggling with diet, binge cycling, binge eating, etc. Check out either stopfightingfood.com, which is, I think, where you must have found me, because that's where my video training series is, which is like a sort of an intro to my personal point of view around food and body image. And then also isabelfoxenduke.com, which is my personal website. My blog is there. People, I think that that's a primary way that people learn about my position around food and body and kind of get like the deep dive on how I help people heal, specifically diet binge cycling patterns and binge eating. And then, of course, for those of who are folks who are listening, who are entrepreneurs and who think that they might want to work in, a professional in the body positive space professionally, or in the weight neutral wellness world professionally, you may be, a good candidate for my teacher training program. And I would highly recommend you check out weightneutralcoaching.com, which is sort of the domain name for the center that I'm opening, for the educational center that I'm opening for professionals who want to work in the wellness industry in a weight neutral way.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Isabel. Really appreciate having you here. And I hope you have much more success and we can change this society, make a dent in the bad stats, as I tell people. That's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to do on my end.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, 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 exactly. Thank you so much for letting me share. This has been great.
Thank you for listening to the I Like Networking podcast. If you've enjoyed that conversation, why not send it to a friend? Rate, review, or subscribe to our podcast, because really that helps us a lot. We also have a membership scheme, a mentoring program, online events, digital resources, and much, much more. To get involved with us and figure out everything that we do, just head over to iliketnetworking.uk or find us on Instagram at iliketnetworking. We have more incredible guests coming up next week, so don't forget to tune in every Friday for the podcast. See you next time.